Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us for our webinar today on why has sexual harassment training failed. This is the first of three webinars that are leading up to Culture EQ 2018. And today we'd just like to share a few bits of information on some of the stuff that's gotten us into this very public mess with sexual harassment and what it is that we can do to right the ship and make that a holistic effort across the enterprise. So to get things kicked off today, I'm going to hand the mic off to Dr. Larry Heiner, who's going to give us some introductions on who's speaking in our webinar today.
Sure, great. Thanks very much. And we are excited to do this. We've had a team working on this the last several weeks of putting together both legal and personal people aspects of this issue, and we think we have something really good to offer to you. We're going to begin that discussion today. So for myself, I have been striving to traverse the intersection between contemplation and action by lifelong education. I continue to build, modify, reiterate, change, and act, and it's always been my way to do that. My formal education, culminated in a doctorate in organizational psychology, is complemented by perennial immersion in professional training conferences. I have 40 plus, I'm starting to date myself there, years of professional experience, and that's kept all of this acquired knowledge in meaningful play. My latest business pursuit is as co-owner of Workforce Equanimity with my son and business partner, Lawrence Heiner. And we believe that really to be an effective workforce, everyone must be enabled through persistently mindful preparation to learn, think, and act with an intention to create an environment that honors human dignity. Speaking of my son, Lawrence has 15 years of experience in designing and facilitating workforce development programs. His clients include Verizon Wireless, some major grocery retailers, and the state of California. Recently, Lawrence has spent time connecting with employee behavioral elements of solving this sexual harassment epidemic with legal training that exists and is evolving. Also joining us remotely are Sejal Friday. Sejal possesses litigation experience in employment and related matters with an emphasis on wrongful termination, sexual harassment, discrimination, and retaliation cases. She counsels management, human resources personnel, and employees on all facets of the employment relationship. She also provides workplace civility training that focuses on promoting respect and civility in the workplace, along with focused training on eliminating unwelcome or offensive behavior that is based on characteristics protected under anti-discrimination laws. Also joining us is attorney Tim Del Castillo, and Tim practices employment law litigation, providing strategic and preventative advice and counseling to employers and executives. His time with international law firms and experience in navigating the often complex world of California and federal employment laws. What he enjoys most about his now independent practice is helping individuals and smaller business owners for whom employment-related legal issues often hit closer to home. Tim received his JD from Pepperdine University School of Law and his BA from Franciscan University of Steubenville. He currently serves on the Executive Committee for Labor and Employment section on the board for the Solo and Small Firm Division for the Sacramento County Bar Association. Okay, so really to get this kicked off, to get us started, one of the first questions with which our team wrestled when we were putting this together was, is it really possible to prevent sexual harassment or harassment of any nature, really, in the workplace? To open up this question, Tim, if you would, please talk to us about the nature and costs of harassment and why the current approaches to curtailing it are not really working. Tim?
Can we do it? Our answer is yes, we have to do it. We can do it because we have to do it, because people deserve better. So our answer is yes, but we have to do something different. And it's probably true that no one needs convincing that what we're doing now isn't working. Sexual harassment in the workplace is an epidemic at this point. We're all familiar with the news, the Harvey Weinsteins, the Matt Lauers, the Bill Cosbys. I could go on and on. Seems like every day or every week there's a new celebrity or public figure, including members of the judiciary, that are being exposed. And we all know for every public case, there are 1,000 lesser known cases. Thus, we have the Me Too movement. So what are we doing now to prevent harassment? What are we doing in California specifically? Let's focus for 1 minute on California's legal requirements. California currently, we have AB 1825. It requires sexual harassment training for employers that have 50 or more employees. However, it requires sexual harassment training. However, this only applies to anti-harassment training for supervisors, and it only must be given every 2 years. Well, I think the limitations on that requirement are obvious. Does sexual harassment only occur when a work site has 50 or more employees? Of course not. Is it only supervisors who are harassing? Of course not. And is every 2 years good enough? Nope, not good enough. Also, side note, as of this month, this training was updated to require discussion of harassment based on gender identity, gender expression, and sexual orientation. So it doesn't include just sexual harassment. Now, why is this not enough? Well, we know the problem is bigger than California, some of the other obvious reasons that we talked about. And we're not talking just about legal compliance. We're having a sexual harassment and workplace crisis, not just because of laws. What we need is a culture change, and that's what this group is really working to focus on with our webinars and our full-day seminar. So what's some of the statistics that illustrate for us that the problem is not working? That what we're doing currently is not working. Well, according to a recent NBC News and Wall Street Journal poll, 48% of currently employed women are experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace. 2/3 of Americans, 67%, believe that sexual harassment happens in almost all workplaces. And 41% of currently employed men admit that they have personally witnessed the mistreatment of women in the workplace. This is a problem. This is 2018. This should not be happening. So we've talked about some of the reasons why what we're doing now isn't working. And I think another challenge in preventing sexual harassment that we face on the ground level is recognizing gray areas. The reality for employers is that harassing conducts, whether something is sexual harassment or not, isn't always black and white from a legal perspective. There are those situations that are what you would call gray areas. Sejal, how would you suggest, how do you train employers and leaders to deal with the challenge of these gray areas?
Well, thanks, Tim. There are a lot of gray areas that we need to deal with. And I think after you mentioned some of the cases that we've been hearing about in the news, it's obvious that this is an issue that's not going away. So a couple of the things I wanted to focus in on right now is that this issue comes up a lot during my trainings and I want to make it very clear that to be unlawful conduct has to be unwelcome. That's one of the components that we have to prove. And this often gets confused with conduct being consensual, whether it's consensual or not. So it's important to keep in mind that voluntariness doesn't always equal consent. Okay, so as a general rule, it's not sexual harassment for a supervisor to, let's say, for example, extend a social invitation to someone under his supervision or her supervision. This is the same, and the same rule applies to those invitations by other coworkers. But we want to be careful to not confuse voluntariness with consent. Just because someone, puts up with a certain amount of sexual banter or sexual advances or flirtatious behavior or any other type of offensive conduct, that doesn't always mean that the conduct is welcome. Okay, there's a lot of different reasons why people don't complain or speak up about conduct that's making them uncomfortable. One of the most important being that they fear retaliation. So we need to also keep in mind that this is even more heightened when there's a power disparity because of a superior position. So when this happens, a person is likely to put up with more offensive or uncomfortable conduct, and because they're afraid of retaliation. And in this case, the power disparity element adds a different context to a case because the employee may find it difficult to decline the social invitation. They may feel subtle pressure to go along with it. And then they may just have fear, for example, of being seen as a troublemaker. So as management, we need to be aware that if there's a power disparity, we need to handle that case more carefully. Another issue that's important on this topic is the impact of unconscious bias and how this impacts diversity and inclusion. We all have unconscious biases, right? These are the quick and often inaccurate judgments that we make based on our limited facts of our life experiences. But when this takes place in the work context, it becomes a big deal because sometimes our unconscious biases are so hidden, even from ourselves, that we know that it's going to take some time to identify and be aware of them before we can make sure it's not impacting our decisions in the workplace. So for example, I looked up some research. The implicit association test found that they did a global online research study in a project called Project Implicit, where they surveyed over 200,000 participants. And in this case, 76% of the participants were found to be biased towards associating men with careers. And then 68% of the participants admitted that they were biased over hiring white skin over dark skinned individuals. Okay, so these types of statistics are just staggering. Another case I looked at was about names on resumes. And a research that was done by the U.S. National Bureau of Economic Research found that ethnic names can have a significant influence on the evaluation of resumes. So in this study, they found that there was significant disparity in the number of callbacks that were received by Asian, Hispanic, and Black applicants versus those individuals who had white-sounding names. Okay, and so basically they sent out the same resumes, identical resumes, but just played around with the names, and it found that there was a huge disparity between who was getting calls back. Okay, so there's so many studies that highlight this point, and if we can't have the tools to identify when these biases are preventing us from making good decisions in the workplace, then we're essentially impacting the diversity in our organization and inclusion from hearing and considering different points of views, which can obviously foster us from having multiple points of view and maximizing productivity in the workplace. So these are just some of the examples I wanted to share with you today. At our upcoming live presentation, I'm going to be actually providing everybody with more statistics on this issue to help managers and HR folks and anybody else that attends the presentation to be able to have the tools to work with their staff to make sure that these biases don't impact their decisions. And the other thing I wanted to point out is additionally, having an inclusive organization is not only going to help to foster a workplace of diversity and civility, but it's also going to improve us in many different areas. So on this topic, Lawrence, can you talk to us about how some of the other hidden risks of non-compliance can impact the organization?
Yeah, thanks, Sejal, and thank you for giving us some of the statistics and data behind what's going on with implicit bias. I know that that's a major problem that we look at as well, and affecting productivity and engagement is a big concern of ours. And as we were hearing all of the news on instances of sexual harassment, the Me Too movement, we started to think about the impacts that has on a company's productivity and their engagement rate of their employees, and really got to thinking about how it is that the work that we do in developing a positive communication culture inside of an organization, and where everyone feels like they can learn to do their job better and move up in an organization, how that's immediately hampered by sexual harassment and the power struggles that go on there. So when we're looking at a holistic approach to solving sexual harassment in the workplace and other forms of harassment and discrimination in the workplace, the work that's done on the legal side and on the training of the legal aspects of that is very important. And we tip our hats to Sejal and Tim and their colleagues for setting a path for that for companies to follow. What we would like to do is enhance that by taking a holistic look at the organization and what impacts can be made by implementing supportive strategies to increase people's level of communication, to increase their comfort with engaging in conflict in a productive way. And how that has a relation to a company's turnover and their productivity. Right? So when a company is dealing with sexual harassment actively in their organization, or if it is being covered up in some way because people do not feel comfortable in coming forward, then that has some hidden effects.
Sure. One of the things that I wanted to point out to everybody is the EEOC, Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, came out with a report last year, June of last year, that essentially said that we need a complete reboot of the way that we've been doing our training. And when I just remember when I was litigating cases in court, really, I kept hearing from both sides. I was a defense attorney and I worked with clients that were small and big. And on both sides, the employee was telling me the same thing that the employer was telling me. And both the sides were telling me that I wish I would have known that. I wish I would have known that these were my rights, because we wouldn't have ended up here. And so, it became very clear that by the time the case hit the law, got to the courtroom, there's really no winners. And the numbers demonstrate that. And so the EEOC study, and if anybody needs a copy of it, you can feel free to email us afterwards, and we'll be more than happy to share that with you. But really pointed out that the cost of litigation, that if that's the only goal of having training, that's not going to be effective. However, it's important to keep in mind that is one aspect that is extremely important to companies. There's no question that prevention of these complaints and of harassment is the best defense against discrimination claims. So in a study that was published in late 2015 by Hiscox, they analyzed employment-related lawsuits in the United States. And these numbers are really just outrageous. I mean, when you think about the numbers that it takes, they found in their study that it takes 275 days on an average basis to resolve an employment matter. I'm thinking that was in 2015. I can pretty much say that from my experience, that number is a lot higher now. Okay, and also what the study found is that 19% of the cases resulted in a settlement payment. by the employer. Additionally, the average total cost of claims that resulted in the defense and settlement payment was $125,000. That's a lot of money to defend in a lawsuit. Okay, and the percentage of these charges that were resulting in payment by the insurance company, most of these cases were found to be unfounded. So what that means is if the company had followed the proper process and had leadership on board and provided adequate training, that this money could have been saved. So these types of numbers really make us realize that we have to take a look at all of this from the beginning. Tim and I have handled cases that have been simple all the way to complex, and we both have probably handled cases that when we look back on them, we say, I can't believe that this much money was paid out on that case because it wasn't handled in a proper manner. So it's really important to take these cases seriously now, especially in light of all these new ones. And so Larry, can you tell us why it's important for everybody to be involved in these prevention efforts?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Seiko. Let's talk a little bit about the people and social aspect of this, because we've talked about the legal and economic and business and productivity and such, and all of that is extremely important. And we have to remember that we're dealing with real people in real events. One of those phenomena that we're talking about, besides the business costs, are the social costs. And Dr. Christy Sim, S-I-M, and you see the link there down at the bottom of the page, and if you revisit the recording, hopefully that'll be active and you can click on that or type it in. But she did a literature review of some of the literature around bystander intervention or lack thereof. Part of this, starting off, is a definition of bystander, someone who witnesses an event but is not directly involved in the event itself. So you're standing there and you're watching and you see something that you believe may be, an unwanted kind of behavior from one actor to another in your office space. There's two ways that you can respond. You can be passive and you can be do nothing about that, just ignore it and move on. Or you could be a pro-social bystander, and that's one who intervenes when you witness the event between a perpetrator and a victim. And then there's 4 stages that you need to follow in order to actually do something. So stage 1, of course, is noticing the event and interpreting it as a problem, stage 2. And then you really have to feel responsible for dealing with it. And this is probably the key step, the key stage. We often witness it and we often say, no, that's not right. I don't think that's right. Then we have to say, I've got to do something about this. And so that is a motivation kind of thing and a cultural thing. And then, of course, you need to possess 4th stage is possess the necessary skills to act. You need to know where to go and to whom file a complaint, or do you deal with it directly or what? Some of the barriers then, when we talked about the motivation, what are some of those barriers that kick in when you want to feel responsible for it? Dr. Sim identified several in the literature review, and I'll run through some of those for you. There's social influence, because you say, well, nobody else is doing anything about it, so I guess I don't have to. There's audience inhibition. I'm in front of all of these people, and they're going to look at me, and I've got to act, and I've got to do something, and it might be embarrassing. There's a diffusion of responsibility, and that's the assumption that, yeah, well, somebody else will notice it and do something about it. Their supervisor, manager, or somebody else on the team will do something about it. That often doesn't happen, we know. There's fear of retaliation. So if you step in, and maybe it's a supervisor or one of your coworkers who is the perpetrator here, and you step in and you say something about it, and they get reprimanded or whatever, or even just embarrassed by it, there might be retaliation on you. So it's a can be a legitimate fear. And then there's something called pluralistic ignorance. And we don't understand others' desires to intervene and believe their desire to intervene must be wrong. So it's related to the diffusion of responsibility in that you think that the crowd should act. So there's a quote in Dr. Sims' studies here I think is important for me to wrap up this part with. Knowledge about the law is not enough to change behavior. Discussions about the law must be framed positively so that it can be a springboard for discussing issues in society at large. And that, of course, is what we're advocating in through these webinars and in our live training coming up. So I think there's some other business costs of bystander apathy. The employer has responsibility for these tangible employment actions, and there's some real strict liability around that, a lot of law around that. And so there's the responsibility, the legal, and then of course fiscal, right? So that winds up being a business cost. If there's a hostile work environment, not just particular incidents, but you have a hostile work environment, you're liable in that case as well. So that could be another business cost if someone brings suit around that. So if you knew, starting to address some of this bystander non-intervention, some of the laws and some of the cases are resulting in cautions for people who would not speak out when they should be speaking out if they're witnesses. So on all those areas, there are definitely business costs. So social costs and business costs as well. All right, so we're wrapping it up. Where do we go from here? You can, as Sejal talked about earlier, you can reference the EEOC report, and you can go through there. It's topical. There's a summary that you can go through, just some beautiful work that's very accessible. And Lawrence, would you mind giving us some information about the upcoming webinars and the live events that we're going to have?
Yeah, sure. There's a lot of information that we would like to share with you that we didn't have time for on this particular call. So we're going to touch on all of this in a different level of detail at the live event that's coming up in March. We're doing one in Sacramento and one in Oakland. On March 15th, we'll be in Sacramento at McClellan Park, and in Oakland will be March 16th, and the exact site is yet to be determined. You can go to the web address there at the bottom of the screen, workforceeq.com/weevent/cultureeq-2018, and that has links to the remaining two webinars that we'll be holding to discuss other topics, not just the ones that we looked at today, but some additional pieces around leadership and bystander intervention. The workshops themselves are a pretty low cost and have early bird offers for groups and individuals. So investigate that with your teams, see who in your HR and legal department areas would be interested in this, or training areas are all invited. And we look forward to meeting with you live. If you hang on the line here for just a few moments, we'll open up the conversation, and you'll be able to ask us questions and questions to our legal counterparts here on the call. Thanks for attending.